Welcome to Chautauqua Books. My guest today is Tom Keating. There are 18 species of penguins in the world. All of them live in the southern hemisphere except for one, the penguin man, Tom Keating, and he is with us here today. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Roy. It's an honor to be with you again.
We talked a little bit about Saturday's School a little while back, your book. You've got another book now. It's The Penguin, the Turtle, and the Rabbit. Is that the right?
Well, actually, the turtle first, and then the rabbit,
and then the
that's because it's an adaptation of Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare.
Yeah.
And then I've added the penguin, so it's the turtle, the rabbit, and the penguin. Mm-hmm. It's a children's story or children's book.
Well, first things first, I guess, and that is asking you the question: why penguins? What happened?
Well, penguins, because when I was working as an educator, I basically was doing a lot of things with paper and with elected officials and nothing with children. And so I decided that what I would do...
So this is during your administrative...
during my educational years, during my career in '87. Yeah. And I was spending a lot of time lobbying governments and working on education issues, nothing with children. So I decided I would try to do something with kids. And I said, well, what can I do? And I said, well, I'm a teacher, I can talk. And I said, what am I going to talk about? And I said, well, I guess I'll talk about penguins. So I've been talking about penguins since 1987.
And the initial interest in penguins, I mean, where did that come from?
Came from the same reason that basically I like brunettes. I mean, it's like
sex.
Anything else.
It's a sexual relationship. Right?
No, it was just basically I wanted to talk about something that I liked. Like some people like mountains, some people like bikes or fishing.
Brunettes, and your wife is a brunette.
She is, 30 years.
Okay, good.
Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, right. Who's also your partner in many of your ventures?
Well, she has been in a very exciting venture. We just finished spending 2 weeks with our daughter and a friend and my wife and I with the Peruvian scientists on the desert of Peru. And we were there my second time. And during that time, we had the unusual experience of being able to do a lot of videotaping, which we compressed and then sent up to CBS. And Sunday morning, the program with Charles Osgood was kind enough to air our nature segment on April the 9th. And now we've taken that segment and we're going to expand it and do a video called Desert Penguins. It'll be out later in the fall.
Well, clearly, we'll get to the book and essentially a variation on Aesop's fables with a pointed moral to it. But first, penguins themselves, clearly an indicator species, right?
It seems to me that they are, because they're so important in the food chain, and they're so loved by people, and they're so misunderstood by most of the folks. So for me, they are very, very significant, much more significant than I knew when I just looked at them in zoos and aquarium. They're all in the southern hemisphere in 17 different species. And in the food chain, you go from phytoplankton basically to krill or small fish to penguins to whales, and that's it basically, essentially.
Sea lions?
Well, they're in there, but basically it's those 4 steps.
Whales are
that's it.
The predator.
And leopard seals and sea lions.
And what's the primary predator these days? What's the problem?
Leopard seals.
No, I mean in terms of ocean, the viability of the ocean, human beings, tourists, that sort of phenomenon.
Well, I would have to stay still that the natural predators are the worst, but human beings are right there with oil spills, with overfishing, with strangling them with nets, with catching them as pets, and with some uncontrolled ecotourism.
Ecotourism, you've come across ecotourism, you've seen it. You're down there as a support for scientific activity and so forth. You don't consider yourself, I guess, an ecotourist.
I don't in the places I've been in in Peru, because they aren't developed and they're very controlled. Where I go at Punta San Juan is under the control of marine biologists who are affiliated in both Peru and in the United States, very controlled. There's a lot of discussion. I'm doing a lot of reading on what that means and how it relates. And of course, if you go to Australia and you are sitting there watching the little blues come in, you are part of a tourism that uses basically ecology, and it's controlled. But I don't think having more and more and more tourists come in is probably the answer. Maybe controlled ecotourism is an answer.
Now, you photographed from about 100 yards away, about a football field's length away.
Well, excuse me, my first trip to Peru, to Punta San Juan, I did with a small 35 to 70 millimeter camera, and I got basically small pictures and dots. This time I took a better camera, the same distance, and that's for one simple reason, that when you are doing research as I did on Dawson Island for the story of my book, or Robben Island where Nelson Mandela was, or in Peru or Chile, the first and only rule is care for the penguins. Everything else, in my mind and in the people's mind that I worked with, is tertiary or an afterthought. So if you're crawling around the ground to get a good shot and you see the penguins start to move their flippers or shake their heads or start to move away, you know you've not cared for the birds. You care for the birds.
Now, you've been essentially, you're a penguin man in residence at a school in Georgia, in Decatur, I believe, right?
I was in Cobb County for a full year.
How do the children respond to you about your interest in penguins and their interest?
That's a nice question, because they would hug me when I walked in the hall after being away 3 months, and they would call and we would chat and talk while I was there during the day. The reason I did that, I think, is more important than the receptivity. The kids loved it. The reason is that most teachers, regrettably, think about penguins in almost a too narrow way. They think about penguins with an egg on the foot of a penguin in Antarctica, which is an emperor penguin, or a king, which would be in South Georgia. And they tend to teach...
The emperor is the
largest of the 17, yes, and the king is the second largest. And the king is in the late Roger Tory Peterson's idea, and he was one of the leading bird persons in the world, of course, and a native here of this area. That was his favorite bird of all the birds he ever studied.
Really?
Yes. In any event, what happens with educators and teachers in particular in elementary school is they see penguins as something to be taught in January. And that's because they can put a coat on and say it's cold. And I find that they need to broaden that. They should teach penguins year-round, because penguins live year-round. And in January, it's really summer where penguins live. So I'd like penguins to be taught, and that's what I try to do with the Penguin Man in Residence project. I try to teach it one day in each quarter. In other words, teach what the penguin is doing in May, in July, and September, and November. See what they're doing in each quarter. And they're doing something different. They may be losing their feathers or molting. They may be breeding. They may be hanging out. They may be swimming in the ocean. They may be doing things we don't know what they're doing, because for 7 months of the year they're in the ocean and we hardly know what they're doing at all. We have no real science on much of what they do.
Who studies the penguin and their natural habitat in the water? Do you know?
Well, scientists who are marine biologists and zoologists and interested people. Well, they use telemetry machinery and scientific items that they put on their backs, like they do for other specimens. They try to track them with satellites after they have those in place. And we tried to put some on my first trip to Peru, and we were unsuccessful. We were not able to keep up. They knocked them off or whatever, and it's very expensive and difficult. Other scientists will study them when they are basically on land doing what I mentioned, mating or breeding or molting. And I've done some of that.
I think I read that the Galapagos is the farthest north that they are. Is that correct?
That is correct, except I have a friend in the Galapagos,
naturally that is,
who has said now that he has tracked some of them just slightly crossing the equator, which might be able to say now that there are two species in northern hemisphere. Tom Keating, a lover of penguins, and maybe the Galapagos. But essentially they are in the Galapagos. And the reason why they're important in the Galapagos and along the Peruvian-Chilean coast, even though there's desert there, the hottest desert in the world, the Atacama, is in Chile, extends up to Peru. But the reason why they're there is because the cold water comes up from Antarctica, the Humboldt Current, named after a German scientist, and because they have to be in the water all the time, they are basically at home, and then they come on wherever the shore is near where they're basically foraging.
Now, you know the answer to this one clearly, but why not the northern hemisphere? Why not the Arctic?
Well, a couple of reasons. There are land predators in the Arctic. White, large, aggressive polar bears. There are no land predators in the Antarctic. None. Man occasionally with waste and things. So that's one good reason. And secondly, because they evolved, and I believe they've evolved from the southern hemisphere, they basically couldn't get across all of the warm weather, warm water and all, and then migrate to that area. So that's another myth that too many teachers basically tell. They tell Mr. Popper's Penguin, and it's a wonderful book, and I've got it and read it, classic from 1934 or so, but it takes his penguins up to the Arctic, and of course it wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work in part because of diet and the predators.
Mainly the predators.
But I mean, diet is essentially there, the type of...
Mainly the predators, and they couldn't get there if they were. I mean, he could transport them with a plane, perhaps, but
right.
because we have penguins just 60 miles from here at the aquarium at Niagara Falls, and I'm affiliated with the aquarium at Niagara Falls, and have had wonderful experiences there, and Penguin Days will come up again in March of 2001. They have 18 penguins from the desert of Peru. And it's the only aquarium in the nation that has Peruvian penguins.
Are aquariums doing any valuable ecological work in maintaining populations, or what is their value other than educational and entertainment, which is...
Excellent question. The answer to that question is yes. And the detailed answer to that is that Patty McGill is doing excellent work with the species survival plan in the Brookfield Zoo, which is in Chicago, and she keeps up with all of the breeding of the penguins, the Humboldt penguins in the United States, and Pierre DeWitt is doing the same in his zoo in Holland. And so, yes, we have a good understanding of the breeding, the male, the genders, the replacement, the moving them around, and that's a very serious bit that the aquariums do, in addition to excellent research, science, and education, and entertainment.
I noticed you were involved in Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago.
I have performed there on Earth Day.
That seems to me a kind of pathetic penguin
enclosure and all?
Enclosure, right. I mean, it's just like locked in behind a little glass cage. And
you probably saw that a long time ago.
I see.
Yeah, it's already been renovated. And in fact, I happened to be there the day that they were still in that zoo, and they in that enclosure, and they moved them.
I see.
And I had a chance to watch them move out to snow in the middle of a Chicago day, and now the new exhibit is outstanding. The difficulty with any of the older enclosures and all is that the state of the art in the 70s is not the same as the state of the art in 2000. It's kind of like a TV studio. This isn't CBS, and so you have to do with what you can.
Yeah, the content is so much better than CBS, of course.
Quite.
Right, okay. Well, we got that established. One of the things that you talked about, Robben Island, did you get a chance to look at the prison where Mandela served so many years?
I have been to Robben Island on 2 occasions, and that's when I was working at Sandcob and trying to rehabilitate penguins that had been injured by oil spills. And I was involved in an oil spill in '98, a small one compared to the tragedy we just had this summer. And when I was there, I asked to go to Robben Island, also to Dawson Island, which was the picture that I showed in the book. I know we'll get to that story. But it's an island that's south of Robben Island. And I went to Robben Island and was able to go in not only the one cell, which is the one that is the photo op that everybody goes in, the president and others, but I went in 2 other cells and tried to determine whether or not he could hear nature sounds, birds, gulls, and penguins. And I still have to rethink that, because though he was close enough geographically, the colony may have come in after he was there.
Really?
Other prisoners were still there, and I think that other prisoners could have heard nature sounds and other birds, but maybe not penguins. I read on the internet that he could. What I'm more interested in is some work that is being done by Mario, who is one of the keepers there and one of the former guides and all. And this is an unusual museum now, because they have former prisoners and former guides, and former warders, they call them, or guards, working together now as guides of the prison. So you have a former prisoner who was there for 20 years, now hand in hand with a former guard who was beating him up, telling you about Robben Island. It's an unusual place.
Really?
Yeah, I'd like to go back.
One of the things, it takes a bit of time money to pay for the travel and so forth. How can you recoup your expenses on some of the world traveling you're doing on behalf of penguins?
Well, the first thing is I need to restock the Keating Kitchen Foundation, because that's the one that takes care of...
So we put the number up on the...
Well, there is no number, but there is a president of that, and my wife gets to veto most of these trips, and or go with me the last one. So the Keating Kitchen Foundation needs to be restocked. I would love the opportunity to present and to perform and to educate and to inform. Those are the 4 things that I do. And I now have slides available for elderly, and have done many, many slideshows, performances for children, information like I just gave on Robben Island with some unusual pictures as well as slides. And then, of course, I'd like to tell my stories and adventures. And the main story now is the turtle, the rabbit, and the penguin, which I know we're going to get to soon.
Okay, right now.
Oh, well, right now.
Okay. That's a variation on Aesop fable?
It is.
Okay.
And,
tell us about it.
Well, I was on Dawson Island, which is off the coast of Africa.
Near
and
Robben Island.
And near Robben, and it's an unusual island because at one time, Jerry Kearton, who wrote The Island of Penguins in the 30s, thought there were 15 million penguins there. Some say maybe 6 to 9. But now there are only about 60,000 at best. And that's because a wall was designed, and perhaps it can be seen in this picture, but the wall goes around the penguin, around the island, and it was a 3-foot-high wall. And the reason why the wall was there was basically so penguins could not go inland into the island. So they would stop at the wall, breed, lay their eggs, and then the colony, the people from Cape Town could come up, pick up the eggs, and take them back for scrambled penguin eggs in Cape Town as a delicacy. So if you feel that human beings don't interact with penguins, you only need to remember the history of egging that has gone on in the Falklands, gone on in Peru, gone on in Chile, and certainly Dawson Island. Anyway, I was
just there for the picking. It's like the boobies.
It was there to basically just pick, like we do cherries off a tree.
Really?
And so it decimated the colony, and now it's being rebred by many, many good, excellent scientists, one of whom I know very well. So I was on that island, and I saw a rabbit, and I saw a turtle, and I saw penguins. And I said to myself, well, I'd like to write a story someday. And so I have. Perhaps I could read a couple of lines from it.
Please do.
Well, one May afternoon, a turtle, a rabbit, and a penguin were talking about Aesop's story of the tortoise and the hare. The three animals decided to have a race across the island, just like in Aesop's fable. Starting from the beach, the rabbit bounded ahead while the penguin walked as fast as she could, and the turtle crept slow but steady. Soon they came to a salty pond in the rock quarry, and I think you have a picture of that. The rabbit had no idea how to get across. The turtle readied himself to paddle slowly, while the penguin knew she could swim easily to the other side. However, because they were friends, the penguin decided to help the rabbit and the slow turtle. The turtle latched onto the penguin's tail, then the rabbit climbed onto the turtle's back, while the penguin swam with her head straight up like a duck. After crossing the water, all three animals looked gratefully at each other and began moving separately toward the distant lighthouse. This is the first of 3 different hurdles that they came up, and you might show the second one, which is the wall, and then I'll get a picture of the third one from this art drawing from some children. And basically you see in the picture that the second hurdle was a wall, and basically the rabbit jumped up, or propped himself, and so the penguins climbed up like a ladder. The rabbit jumped to the top, slid down to the other side, and they slid down it like basically a sliding board.
So you're not getting attacked by conservative Americans for articulating cooperation as opposed to competition?
Well, I am getting attacked by them, and I welcome the challenge from the far right on that issue, because I think it's a bogus issue. There is competition in life, and there's cooperation in life. And in this particular story, I have a close-up here of the wall that you saw, and that is a drawing from Stephanie Roos, who is a wonderful art teacher, and she went to a class, and the children drew that picture. And so if I might read just the last line, because you kind of gave it away in a sense, but not really. Sorry. No, that one we won't show. That's a third, that's a bramble.
Right.
But then now they're coming to the finish line. And one animal says, after you, says the rabbit. And the turtle says, you first. And the penguin says, be my guest. They crossed the goal at the same time. Each understood that the race is not to the swift, nor even to the slow and steady, but that by helping each other, all three were winners. And I think certainly in the race of life, with our families and with our friends and with colleagues, that there is both cooperation and competition.
It's extraordinary to me that is if you read Aesop fables and so forth, although there are multiple kinds of meanings that one can draw out of Aesop, but there's always this anthropomorphic use of animals to illustrate human concepts and ideas.
Yes.
And essentially it violates the animals, because as you noticed, certainly over and over and over, the older male or penguin pushes the other one out of the nest, or gets the food first, or whatever, isn't it?
Well,
I mean,
you
it's
bring
an important
up,
lesson
You bring up two.
for us humans.
You bring up two different things. Nature is red of tooth and claw, and that is very real. And penguins' instinct is survival, but penguins probably don't have the same kind of laughter, intelligence, maybe even the same kind of, if I may say, soul, or certainly some of the same kind of characteristics. So I would at least say that in the earlier time when Aesop was writing, 2,500 or whatever years ago, what would you do? You'd use parables and animals. Now scientists don't like you to be anthropomorphic, but they're so detailed that no one reads what they're doing, or many people don't.
Right.
So I've chosen, as the Penguin Man, to combine my love of a particular animal with the fact that I want to share a lot of different aspects. And then you decide whether there's 16 or 18 kind of penguin species. You decide which gender is the stronger or has the longer beak. But for me, the penguin really is, I think this is the thing I haven't written, and that is a series of columns called People and Penguins, Strange Birds in the Same Nest. And it would be a comparison and contrasting of things we have in common and things we have different.
Right.
But for this particular story, this is one that I saw that was delightful, that they helped each other over these three barriers.
And essentially, that's the method by which children are reached with stories about human life and relationship. I mean, if you don't focus on the particular, you have a greater chance of drawing a moral from the story.
And they're also, of course, taught Little League football and taught how to block the first as soon as they're 6 years old, and to compete. And so they're taught lots. Some children are taught to hate, unfortunately.
Do you get a sense that that some of the children you're talking to carry this over by extension in other areas? I know this is part of the point of your whole the Penguin Man, is to carry the idea of sympathy with life and species and ecosystems. And
so the question would be, do children learn from our encounters
beyond
to
penguins,
also love animals, perhaps, and to relate animals to life? I would think that what's happening, that I'm sure of, is that some of the children I've performed with will see me 8 or 9 years later and grab my shirt and say, "The Penguin Man." They remember the event. They remember touching the stuffed penguin that I bring. They remember the performance with a shower cap or the pajamas. They also remember the information, and I think they remember something in the heart. Whether or not they've changed their behavior in relation to nature, that's why I thought the Penguin Man in Residence was a good approach. One-time deals don't usually do that. I think it takes continuation. I appreciate the opportunity to share this story. Perhaps some will want to hear the story, or perhaps they'll write their own story.
And what's the status of your publishing, your book?
Well, Saturday School has not financed any of my trips yet, but I appreciate you having me a chance to talk about that book. And the Keating Kitchen Foundation will not get rich from this either, but this book is on the desk of one of the leading countries, one of the country's leading children's editors, and say a prayer. And it's tougher to get a children's book published than even another kind.
Oh, yeah.
It's very difficult.
Right.
But it could be a story, and I'm going to perform it wherever I'm invited, and perhaps we might at least mention the email that will be available that people can use.
Well, please do.
Well, it's easy enough. It's penguins@mindspring, MINDSPRING.com. And that email will get to me at any time, and I'd be more than glad to discuss with you. I'm in the Mayville area doing more work between Buffalo, Niagara, and Erie, Buffalo, Jamestown, and Erie, and love to do more work here, particularly when it's not too cold and windy and snowy.
It's back south when it back to Georgia.
Or wherever I can talk about the fact that it's summer when penguins are in January.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Tom, thank you very much.
Roy, thank you for the opportunity to share again.
Okay, well, it's been a delight. We've been talking to Tom Keating, the Penguin Man, and we'll be right back with our next guest. It's Dirk Raitt. We'll be talking about the Mexican Indians, the Tarahumara. Hold on, we'll be right back. welcome back to Chautauqua Books. My guest is Dirk Raitt. He is just recently retired from Fredonia University here in Fredonia, and he is the author of some 8 books. And the one we're going to be talking about, most of them about Mexico history, the Native Americans, Mexico relationships with the U.S., and the one we're talking about today is Mexico's Sierra Tarahumara. It's published by the University of Oklahoma Press. Welcome, Dirk.
Thank you.
The first question, obviously, is Tarahumara. You're a long way from the Tarahumara, and when you grew up, I think, in Utah in the Southwest. What was the interest? How did you get involved in the Tarahumara, and where are the Tarahumara?
Okay. Well, the Tarahumara are about 40,000 native peoples who live in northwestern Mexico. I do have a map there. Maybe it'd be easier, but
it's south of
Chihuahua. Well, what you
province.
do if you're familiar with northwestern Mexico, if you go to El Paso, Texas, and go 200 miles due south from El Paso to Chihuahua City, and then go about 170 miles west and south, you'll be in the heart of the Sierra Tarahumara. The Sierra Tarahumara is that part of the
Texas here.
Is that part of the Sierra Madre Occidental, the western mountains of Mexico, that's found in the southwestern portion of the state of Chihuahua, and you can see that state of Chihuahua on the map. And that area, which is a very rugged, remote region that of canyonlands, country, and mountain country, is the homeland of the Tarahumara Indians, and there are about 40,000 Tarahumaras in the Sierra, in the mountain country, the canyon country. There's another 10, 17,000 of the Tarahumaras that have gone beyond that region or out in the state of Chihuahua, and state of Durango, and other parts of Mexico. Now, my interest, you said you were a Utah native. Did I get that?
Not a Utah native, but I lived in Bountiful.
You did live in Bountiful.
Right.
Okay. Well, not everybody knows about Bountiful, right? And I was raised in Ogden, and I was educated in Utah, went to University of Utah, and like a lot of people out west, I really like the West, I really like the Southwest. I go back, I say go back home. I've been here since 1970, but I still talk about going back home, okay?
Really?
I like the East. I married a woman from the East, but I can't get the mountains and the sandstone out of my boots, right? In graduate school, I worked on a project for several years with Gregory Crampton, who's my mentor, my teacher, and he was doing a history of the Glen Canyon and the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. This is when the U.S. government had come in and was creating this dam site at Page, Arizona. And when they finished with the dam at Page, Arizona, the whole area for 120 miles upstream was going to be the new artificial Lake Powell. Well, whenever the government's going to come in and have a major reclamation project, they have to justify what they're doing by hiring scholars, archaeologists, and historians to come into the area beforehand and write the history and prehistory of these regions before they get inundated and destroyed. So
and that's almost a given, isn't it?
Yeah, and
inundated and destroyed.
A good part of the country was by that reclamation project. But on the other hand, it was a boondoggle for me, the historian, because we spent 4 wonderful summers going down the Colorado River and writing and recording the history of that canyonland country. And I said to myself at the time, by the way, and when you're going through that kind of country, you become familiar with the remnants of the Anasazi culture, the basket maker cultures of the American Southwest that go back to 900, 1000 AD. And, you just become interested in the indigenous populations and their history in the country. And I just said to myself that when I graduated that one of these days when the dissertation was way behind me and I could do what I wanted to do, I would find a canyon and do for that in Mexico, and do for that canyon what Crampton was doing for the Grand Canyon of Arizona. And lo and behold, a few years later, I went down to Chihuahua and to the Sierra Tarahumara, and not only did I find one canyon, I found 4 canyons, each one of which was deeper and larger than the Grand Canyon of Arizona. And although they have similarities and a similar geological history, There are differences, but the biggest difference is a historic and social one. This is a homeland of 40,000 Tarahumara Indians still living there today. And it was a very romantic place. I thought, you know, at that time I'd travel in my Pathfinder and go from Chihuahua City and go through La Junta and up to Creel and down into Batopilas and what have you, and almost felt like I was in a time machine where I would be able to go back to a pastoral West, something maybe that the West had been in this country in the 19th century before it became a hydraulic West, at least of the World War II era.
Many of the Jesuits who were there, as you point out in the book, in the 15th century, I guess, and subsequently, not that early.
They're the 17th
later.
century.
17th, okay, 1600s. Didn't speak Tarahumara. Did you? Did you learn the language?
No.
It must be very difficult, huh?
Here's one thing I should mention. If you look at the book's title, it's called Mexico, Sierra Tarahumara, subtitle, a photo history of the people of the Edge. And if you read the book carefully, you'll notice several chapters a chapter on mining, a chapter on the railroad. You know, I deal with the 19th, 20th century as well as the colonial period and the so-called pre-colonial period. It's not a history of indigenous America. It's not a history of the Tarahumara. It's a history of this region of the world and all the people, Tarahumaras and non-Tarahumaras alike. Okay? And I'm a historian, but I'm not a ethno-historian. And I worked on this project with a photographer, but he's not an anthropological filmmaker. And we were interested in everybody, outsiders and Tarahumara alike. But it's obvious when you're doing a book like this, the Tarahumaras become the central, the central.
That's the most intriguing thing.
Yeah, the plot for most people, right?
Surely. You mentioned, you say along these lines that the methodology will irritate and even anger some. That's what you're talking about then, in terms of.
Well, that was sort of dealing with the at the editorial phase of all this, or when they were deciding when Oklahoma was trying to decide whether to accept this manuscript or not, they sent it out to readers, right?
I see.
And anthropologists.
So this is talking to a small group of people. This little line.
These are really what I call the neo-modern modernists, who, and some of the feminists, who were really kind of unhappy with the way I treated the Tarahumara, who felt that that I was also presenting a narrative that was an outsider's or an imperialist point of view. And I didn't really see that issue at all. I just felt that I was doing the kind of work that most historians do. Somebody else can come along who's an ethno-historian and do a much better job of maybe recreating the history of the Tarahumara, where you can have more of the Tarahumara's point of view. But you've got to remember also there are a variety of Tarahumara points of view, whether you're talking to somebody who's been partially acculturated in Spanish, who's along one of the dirt roads, or whether you're talking to somebody in the interior who has very little experience with outsiders. You can get a very different point of view as to what a Tarahumara is and what their life is like. So,
well, we'll show some of these photographs because they're beautiful photographs, and we'll just flip through some of them. But
should I mention just for a second that the photographer is George Janicek, and I met him in Salt Lake when I was a visiting professor of history there, and he was kind of he was a professional photographer, but a freelancer, and had done some other kinds of things. And we hooked up after I was in Salt Lake, and we traveled together several years in this Sierra Tarahumara country. And then in '89, when Czechoslovakia underwent the Velvet Revolution, lo and behold, George's family got returned to them all the property that had been nationalized by the communists 20 years before. And so he had to go back to Prague and back to Pilsen and run a four-story hotel 1 block from Pilsen and become a kind of an entrepreneur. And after that date, we sort of traveled separately, but still continued the project. But he's the photographer, and we've got about 100 black and white photographs that have been reproduced. And it was a different kind of project because I was, unlike most things that I've done in the past, I didn't use historical photographs that most historians would use. I didn't want to confuse the issue because I was doing a photo history, and I didn't want to confuse the reader by having photographs that were not photographs that were done by George Janicek. So what I tried to do was interpret as best I could the photographs of Janicek's photographs, both historically and sociologically, and I tried to write the text around the photographs. And I've done that, although the layout doesn't really tell you that, because the editors decided it was too expensive to run a photograph with each particular page, where there'd be a direct correlation. So,
well, I don't think it hurts. I mean, I think one flips back through the photographs as you read the text and finds the reference.
It'll work back and forth if you spend some time with it.
Absolutely. I mean, the one we just showed there, the young man with the Coca-Cola bottle and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's referenced, you know.
In the text, right at the end of the chapter.
If Columbus had worked his way in, his people had worked his way in, would he have into the Sierra Tarahumara? Would he have found the gold and the silver that Spain sent him to find?
Columbus, no. But
I mean, had he been able to? I mean, there was a lot of gold and silver extracted from the Sierra.
Right.
By a great deal of people. I mean,
right. You know,
Americans.
and I'm just, I would assume, okay, well, I would assume, when you say Columbus, I'm a little thrown off because what Columbus didn't have a lot of expertise in terms of mining techniques. He made use of,
it's just
the island
weapons.
Indians had to go around and collect through placer mining a lot of the treasure of the islands. But I think generally speaking, the descendants of Columbus did go into that area and in the Sierra Tarahumara. But you got to remember that after about 1550, the Spaniards were very exploitive of the silver resources of Mexico, and they started down in central Mexico and worked their way all up through northern Mexico. Several big finds. Bato Pilas, which is probably the most important mining center in this area, was ranked number 9 in colonial times as one of the 9th most prolific silver mines of Mexico. Got to remember also that in the 18th century, just to put this in a larger context, a series of mines in Guanajuato provided the world economy with 80% of the silver that was in circulation throughout the world, throughout Europe and Asia. And that was all coming
80%.
out of a series of mines in Guanajuato in central Mexico. So silver mines, and especially 18th century Mexico, is really an important part of the story of the world economy.
We have a picture, well, you have several pictures of some old mine shafts. Don't want to jump too far ahead, but is there a lot of mining going on today there?
Well, there's some gold mining, and
it's turned to drugs, hasn't it? I mean, the new mining is, what are the terms for opium?
Mote and goma, and marijuana and opium.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to measure that because the media does hype the drug trade a lot.
Hype it in which way? How do you mean?
Oh, I think they tend to exaggerate what's going on and how much activity is going on and how important it may be for that country and how dangerous it might be in some areas because those make good stories. And, there are instances where Tarahumara people and families have lost their lands to the drug traders, but there are many instances where Tarahumaras have willingly engaged in negotiations to supply some of the drug traders and what have you. I wouldn't, I'm not going to say that it's not a factor, but if you were talking about, if you had an exploitation scale and you say which outside group is really doing the most to upset the ecology of the Sierra, I would have to say it's the timber people. Okay, generally speaking, goes up and down. In '94, 2 years after NAFTA had been approved, the North American Free Trade Agreement. As a part of that agreement, a consortium of timber interests called the Grupo Chihuahua put several...
Is this predominantly Mexican or is it also U.S.?
It's predominantly global.
Global, okay.
Italian, French, German,
Japanese.
Mexican. Who's got money, right, in the global economy.
Sure.
But the consortium went in to the Sierra, on the edge of the Sierra, and built cellulose factories just east of the Sierra, along the railroad, along the train track, at places like Anahuac, and these are places just east before you go into the Sierra. And it looked for a while that they were really going to cut down the trees and exploit especially the eastern range of the Sierra quite badly, the way they had been doing for years anyway. And then in '95 there was a glut on the world's market, and that particular outfit that had been financed by loans that had been made possible through the World Bank and through NAFTA went bankrupt. So their timber activity came to an end, and I don't know if that's been resurrected. You know, it goes up and down with the world market. But I do know, if you look around...
So it's a reprieve, essentially, what you're
yeah,
saying.
if you look around the eastern watershed of that country, there's just, you know, on the eastern side of the Continental Divide of the Sierra, there has been a lot of despoiling of the forests there. And the timber people not only go into these areas and take the timber, but they make roads that go into these countries, and then people follow up on those roads. They attract tourists and bikers, and you know, it's just an invitation for other people to come through. The drug traffickers can make use of these kinds of roads, and at the same time, a lot of the resources that the Tarahumara are dependent upon are becoming more diminished. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of outsiders, and I don't think all the outsiders are equally predatory or equally exploitive. Some of them, you know, in spite of themselves, don't leave much of a mark on that country. Because you've got to remember, the big thing about the Sierra Tarahumara, it's very remote, and it's a very tough country, and you've got to really want something to go in there and destroy the people to get it. And for the most part...
destroying the people is not the primary objective, it's just getting it. It happens to destroy them in the process as a byproduct.
I would say that in the big picture, 400 years of history of Tarahumaras dealing with outsiders, the group that has come to the defense of the Tarahumara most often and most successfully has been the Tarahumara themselves. The state, and the church, and business interests, and mining interests, and timber interests, and ranchers, they all have their own specific kinds of agendas. And oftentimes the Tarahumara is not a victim at all, is very active in the process, takes what he or she wants from the outside world and incorporates it into their own culture. But they're changing, slowly changing, but that doesn't bother me the way it did initially. When I first went into this country in the 1980s, I thought of the Tarahumara as a pristine people who were going to be destroyed by outside influences. And then as I got to know the Tarahumara better and started to see circumstances developing, you know, I was really, you know, in the late 80s, you saw electricity come into the place. You see television coming into Batapilas of all places, and Tarahumaras looking at television through the windows, you know. And you see the timber companies coming in and destroying it, and the railroads going through the top, and they're building roads down through the canyons. And the drug traffickers are doing all this stuff. And you say, oh my God, these people are not going to survive. A few more years, and I started to see that, you know, hey, wait a second, why can I say these people are not going to survive? They've survived 300 years, going on 400 years. The Tarahumara of today is not the same person as the Tarahumara of the 16th century. It's a different kind of Tarahumara. They've been very much influenced, especially by the Jesuits and the colonial church. And the Tarahumara of today won't be the same as the Tarahumara of tomorrow. But I think, you know, they may survive in a little different form, a little changeable form, but I still think they'll be recognizable as a distinctive group 100 years from now. But maybe I'm overly optimistic.
Well, that leads to the question I had, which was, can cultures and groups survive more when they are more resistant? And I know the history of the Tarahumara is that they have been resistant. They have been guerrilla skirmishes in a sense, but comparable, say, to the Zapatistas in Mexico. How would you say that?
Today's Zapatistas, the Chiapas. And
Chiapas. How would those survive versus the Tarahumara?
I think the chances, first off, you've got to remember that when you talk about indigenous peoples in Mexico, you're talking, at least biologically, you're talking about a mixture of people who are Spanish and Indian in terms of their genetic composition. Tarahumaras have, you know, this generation of Tarahumaras have, if you did a genetic profile, they have African genes, they have European genes, you know, or Caucasian genes, whatever you want to say. They have a lot of indigenous genes, you know what I mean? They are different genetically than another so-called Indian group in central Mexico, right? The more you go into the more settled, larger populated regions of central and southern Mexico, the more mestizoized the people are, the more acculturated they are. And so I think it's
Mestizo, in the sense, means assimilado in the same sense.
Yeah, it means like mestizaje, it means miscegenation, it means biological genetic mixing.
Okay.
Okay, and so it's when you talk about the Zapatistas in let's say Chiapas, you're talking about acculturated Indians and a lot of mestizos who are just Mexicans.
Right.
Yet they call themselves Zapatistas. So it's not, these indigenous groups, or some groups are more indigenous than others, is what I'm saying. And I think of all the indigenous groups in Mexico, the Tarahumara are probably have a better claim on really being a truly indigenous people. And it's because, again, in the 18th century, after the 17th century was one where they had strife and conflict with outsiders.
Here, excuse me, but here we have a map of Mexico, New Mexico, and the railroad that runs down to Batopilas, I guess.
Right. Well, it runs through the highland. Batopilas is down in the canyons.
All right. You talk about the cheap fares. One could take cheap fares or very expensive fares. What's your take on it? Do you recommend people go down and look and add to the problem? Because it's a fascinating area, and I would just love to go down there for one.
Yeah,
what's your recommendation?
Since I spent so many years in that area, I could hardly stay home.
Stay out, yeah. It's a predicament, isn't it? I mean, when you write about something you love, you tend to...
Yeah, but I think, I'm too old to get all upset about these kinds of things.
Really? Well, I'm not. I don't know.
I think that you can be a good guest. There are degrees of being a good guest.
Surely.
And
but I mean, like you say, you go down there and you buy some sort of Tarahumara thing, and basically it could be made in the back room by a bunch of poorly paid or made in Korea, and it's just taking a whole population and cranking them into turning out junk.
Well. I suppose, first of a lot of the...
I'm not making this up. This is your book.
A lot of the, you'd have to read for me that section. But anyway,
okay.
I don't use the word junk.
Junk, not junk, no.
But a lot of those trinkets and attractive items that the tourist likes, many of those have been made by Mexicans. And supposedly, they call them a Tarahumara items. But I'm not so certain that... It's a matter. I guess it's just a matter of degree. I've had dealings with Tarahumaras where we wanted to trade something with them, and we'd say, here's a good piece of leather rope or something that you could really use, and if they have no use for it, I don't want it. So this is free. There's there's nothing involved in it. We don't want it and we don't need it. And I think also there's a sense that if you do make it, even if you give somebody something, that maybe there's an obligation to give them something in return, even if it means they've got to say prayers for me or something like that.
Right.
But they take from the outside. Look at their culture, which most of us would describe as their material culture has been quite primitive. But that's not a negative term. It's just very reduced in terms of the material artifacts in their culture. And, but they make necessary adaptations, They adapted the goat to the culture, which they didn't use before. In the 17th century, when the Jesuits brought in the goat, the Europeans brought in sheep. The Europeans brought in fruit and wheat and tools like plows and animals like oxen to pull those kinds of tools. They will take on some of those tools, especially like in the 20th century, a steel axe head. That's, they may not want beads, they may not want a leather tongue, but if you've got a steel axe head, they'll take it. And so it's sort of what has utility to them and makes sense to them in their culture. Look at their religious views. Their religious views are more superposition of Tarahumara views on top of Catholicism rather than
it's called
the other.
Cargo cults, isn't it? I mean, or not?
Well, that's what they use in Africa, and I don't know.
I see. It doesn't extend over.
I don't know.
Okay.
But
anyway, go ahead with what it is.
Well,
their views, religious views.
You go down and you see them celebrating Semana Santa. Semana Santa is a Christian celebration. It's Easter week, okay, Holy Week. And Yet you see the Tarahumaras, this is kind of a very interesting period of time because they dress up in costume and they wear white makeup for the Pharisees. And the Pharisees have a ritualistic conflict with the soldiers, and it all goes back to Christian readings out of the Bible and what have you. And it's very much a Catholic tradition. Yet, if you see the Tarahumaras during Semana Santa, they'll go to the church building, which they hardly attend all year long, and they'll close themselves up and keep the priests out of the church. Really? And then they will drink tezguino, which is corn beer, all night long. They have all night dancing. They make a big party out of it. They carry around a Judas figure which has an extremely large penis. That's an obvious fertility symbol, and which of course is not approved by the Jesuit fathers. And they just have brought, so many of their own modifications.
There's identification with Judas here then?
Well, they'll bring the Christianized Tarahumara know about Judas and Jesus and things like that. But it's so, for example, their notion of God really comes from their religious naturalism. That Father God is associated with the sun, and then there is Mother Moon, and Father God and or Father Son, or the God figure, and God's wife give rise to children, and the male children are called San Cristos, from Jesus Cristo. Jesus Christ figures are called San Cristos, and the daughters, the female offspring, are called saints. So they've taken, the Jesus Christ figure of Christianity and the notion of saints from Catholicism and have woven it into a Tarahumara narrative that doesn't make sense outside the Tarahumara mindset. Okay, right. And it's very much something that is not being taught by the Christian missionaries. But that's how they've done it. They've interpreted it in terms of their own religious naturalism.
And this essentially, the vibrant so-called Christian missionary is Jesuit predominantly. It's not Pentecostal or Mormon or whatever.
No,
they haven't done well, have they?
The Jesuits have been in the country the longest.
Right.
That's probably why they have the most experience and probably are the most sophisticated in their dealings with the Tarahumara. Right. They came in the colonial period. They were kicked out. They came in 1607 to the Sierra Tarahumara. They were kicked out in 1767. They came back again in 1900 and are still there today.
They were kicked out because of the political turmoil back in Rome, mostly?
Well, that's a whole other story. But basically, the King of Spain, being one of the enlightened monarchs of the 18th century, felt that they were too. There were a lot of problems with the Jesuits. One was that the Jesuits didn't pay allegiance to the King of Spain, but rather to the Pope. Yeah. The Jesuits also were very, very successful in the New World, and it created a lot of jealousy. And other orders, the Franciscans were very jealous of the Jesuits. The colonists were very jealous of the Jesuits because they controlled Indian labor and lands. So there were a lot of jealousies and a lot of theological and political reasons for the fact that the Jesuits not only expelled from Mexico, but Paraguay and all of the Americas at the same time.
Did you made no reference in here of liberation theology. I think that was predominantly Jesuit. Was there any effect or any involvement of liberation theologists in the Chihuahua area, or?
Probably in Chihuahua City, where you have the Spanish or the Mexican community, but I didn't see much of that liberation theology. Well, go ahead.
Well, we're almost running out of time, and I would like to back up and just get a little bit of an overview, which I didn't allow you to do, and that is, what was the population at its height, the Tarahumara, and when were they first acknowledged to have been there?
Okay, well, the history before the arrival of the European is very sketchy. Archaeology is very limited in terms of what we know about the early history of these people. They're probably related to southwestern Indians. They were probably hunting-gathering people who, about maybe the 14th century, started to engage in horticulture. And then as they come into the colonial period, they get into a full-blown, what do we call, transhumance horticulture, which means they go up in the mountains in the summertime and go down the canyons in the wintertime.
So they're
going
not
back and
driven
forth.
there by more ferocious indigenous populations, essentially?
Not these days.
No, I mean initially. They were
Initially, they withdrew to the canyon country in the south and western edges of the Sierra Tarahumara in the 18th century because of the pressure of European expansion and the Apaches down on the plains.
I see. One last question, and that is, among the popular films about the era, about that particular place in the world, what films are there? Are there something that touch on
Popular films?
Yeah, popular films. I mean, the Treasure of the Sierra Madre type films. Nothing.
I used an excerpt of that from that film in our
I
videotape we did on the project.
I just kept thinking about that film as I thought, well, we're pretty much out of time. There's no film, but that's okay. Well, it's a marvelous book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very
Appreciate
much. We have, I think, about 5 seconds. You're working on another book.
Yep.
Very quickly.
It's called Occidental Orb, the Americas and World History. Westview Press in Colorado is going to publish it if I ever get it written.
Okay.
Which will happen, but I won't miss. I'll miss the deadline.
It'll be a 9th book.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
thanks very much, Dirk. We've been talking to Dirk Raitt. He is the author of a great many books on Mexico's history. The one we've been talking about today is a photo history of the Tarahumara, the people on the edge. And from listening to Dirk, it's not so much on the edge of existence, but on the edge of much of the known world in the mountains of the Sierra in Mexico. And thank you for watching Chautauqua Books. And I want to thank my cameraman, Joe Rada, and Chuck Kelsey, who's running operation back there, and Devin Taylor. And thanks for watching Chautauqua Books.